Hello. It's pretty late here, so I thought I'd read some spooky, scary stories for you. But first, I'm gonna go get a drink because my throat is fucked. So let's go take a walk down the hallway. Oh boy. Yeah, the same. Just running. Okay, so right. Yeah, no, I should just get water. Soda. My throat doesn't need soda. Wunderbar. Okay. Okay. Oh boy, how am I gonna do that? Okay. Right. Spooky, scary. Hey, Delphi, I'm back. Got water. What is up, buddy? Yeah. How are you? All right. Well. Um, fuck. Mm, 2 minutes. It's crazy how fast time goes. Anyway, I'll probably let my hair up. Yeah. Okay, this better not be bots. I swear. I mean, knowing this site, they probably. Knowing this site. No, boy. Knowing this site, it's probably bots because, yeah, that's usually what happens, but, who knows? Fucking. I swear, it used to be such a different fucking site. I don't even know if the audio's fucking working, but you know, whatever. Um. Okay, no. This ain't real. This ain't fucking real. Yeah, I'm just turning off the chats for myself because I don't need to see none of this bot nonsense. Fuck that. Um. Anyway, so I was debating about which spooky stories I should read, but really, there's a lot in my library that I could have fucking chose from. So I mean, I don't know. Okay, I don't know who the fuck that is, but okay. Just gonna turn the camera around. As you can see, my library is quite extensive. I could have chosen many of some spooky stories, but I was feeling in the mood for like classic British eeriness. So I went with classic British eeriness because, yeah. So Compulsory Games by Robert Eichmann. I think I did a review of this in the past, but it was when I still had the fucking gross ass beard, and that was disgusting. It's gone now, thank God. I wish I didn't have this fucking little tick of nature called facial hair. It's awful. I hate it. It's fucking vile. Oh, wow. My language is driving people away. Good. Fucking good. So good. So, I debated which one of these to read. I'm starting with Eichmann. And my favorite of these in this, I mean, they're all really, really good. They're all quite spooky, but I thought that I would choose Wood. I forgot what page it was on, that's why I checked. This one in particular, when I read it, I think I remember saying in my review that this one in particular scared me shitless. Well, no, it was more. That's a bit of that's hyperbole. It's very British eeriness. Which I mean, Eichmann is very well known for making the horror so subtle that a lot of the time it creeps up on you in a really strange way. I'm yapping. I'm just talking and such, but yeah, the way he writes his stories is really quite fascinating. Why are there so many people? I swear, I don't understand. I don't have that many subscribers. Anyway, actually, should I start with a? Yeah, I think I will. I think I'll start with one that isn't my favorite in the collection. I'll start with Le Mira. This one is also quite good, but you know, whatever. If I persist in gazing, myself I shall adore. William Congreve, Smeel. Celia's father was old enough to be her grandfather, perhaps her great-grandfather. Notoriously, it is one of the advantages that men have over women. Okay, yeah, I mean, he had beautiful silvery hair and a voice like a distant bell of indeterminate note, but unfortunately he could move only very slowly, and even then aided by a shiny black staff, with a most handsomely jeweled knob. Celia had never known her mother, and that lady's portrait was always turned to the wall, from which position, in accordance with her father's adjuration, she had never cared to drag it, or to set about dragging it, for it looked very heavy. The old house was crumbling now. I already told the channel what book it was, so you're probably just going to have to rewind the stream. Like I don't know, a thinking person. Maybe try thinking. I'm very blunt. I don't fucking care. Um, right. The old house was crumbling now, and something beautiful was lost to it with every year that ended. Even the drawing of an even the drawing of an unknown, smiling woman by Raphael. Even the tiny box found in the Prince of the Muscova's fob and soaked in his blood. In the end, wow, okay, in the end, one would have thought that there remained only the mirrors, the looking glasses, if you insist. The mirrors are looking glasses, and the bare utilities for the bare living, which has to substitute for life. All the looking glasses were, of course, mercury silvered, so that, as well as reflecting, they embellished and discriminated. In each of the state rooms there were 3 or 4 of the objects. On the walls, on the floor stands, on the bureau and the escritoires. I'm probably mispronouncing that, I don't care. I'm just... I know the meaning, but I don't know how to pronounce some of these words, yeah, anyway, you'll have to look it up if you want to know the meaning. I'm not explaining shit. In the state bedrooms, the look... In the state bedrooms, the looking glasses were even more suitably placed, and even more suitably placed and more ingeniously set. I swear, I read better in my head. Yeah. In that long ago, they had been offered more curious topics to touch upon. It is unnecessary to select from the lists of past guests because the lists included everyone. Day by day, Celia's father would toil round the rooms, struggling up the grand staircases, crawling perilously down. Okay, whatever. Crawling perilously. Wow. Fucking whatever. Struggling up the grand staircases, crawling perilously down them in every room, on every landing, at every dark corner, gazing in the looking glasses, outstaring time. Sometimes, at a respectful distance, he was followed for much of the way by his old nurse. The more commonly, nurse was confined by neuritis and weak-headedness to her bed in the little apartment under the flaking tiles that she'd occupied since she first came. How old nurse could be was a subject sedulously eschewed. Right from the cradle, and Celia's cradle had aforetime cradled both the shapely John Dryden and the unproportioned Alexander Pope, Celia had vouchsafed her frail, dreamlike drawings, in pencil, even in chalk, and later with watercolor finely touched in. Bark in every ancient tree, by every condition of light. The Elizabethan oaks, the capability brown beeches, the single exotics planted with ceremony by Mr. Palgrave, by Bishop Wilberforce, by the Prince Imperial. The tenant farmers' herds served well as artistic auxiliaries, and sometimes at dusk the mad hunt, which all at these times could hear, but only those with the sight could behold. It was natural that when at length Celia had arrived at her 16th birthday, she would wish to go to Paris in order to increase her power and widen her range. Still, in a dream, she found herself enrolled at a long-established and old-fashioned private atelier. Etienne's it had been familiarly named by many generations of students, some of them always British. One felt that Watteau and Greuze must have been among the more recent pupils, Claude among the earlier professors, but now, as is often found with aging institutions, 7/8 of the attendants were excessively youthful, too young to be taken quite seriously as anyone, to be too young to be taken quite seriously as yet by anyone. The remaining 1/8 was composed of shaky eccentrics and inadequates who had been attending, and, of course, contributing since the year dot. The professors were wayward, though one or two were geniuses, and merely at cross purposes with the times in which they found themselves. Genius, however, comes normally in inverse measure to the capacity to impart. The two things were strongly opposed. One of the pupils, a very old, very tough American woman, brought a sackful of cakes and pastries for consumption by all during the 2 breaks each day. Celia, aged 16 and 11 days, Celia, aged 16 years and 11 days, "Give me back my 11 days," she cried out in a brief moment of melancholy, was escorted to France by Mr. Burfey, the chief clerk in Totland's, her father's solicitors, and of course her own too. They even consumed an evening meal of a sort in the restaurant at the Gare de Lyon, the most gorgeous in Europe. But all the arrangements had really been made by Celia's distant cousin Rolf, who lived with 2 other men of the same generation in a beautiful house up the hill in the Don, and who knew all the ins and outs. Cousin Rolf fixed Celia up at Etienne's, and he even found her a nearby apartment, very high up, with with 2 rooms, though small ones, and with what amounted to a private staircase down to the sanitary facilities on the floor immediately below. Celia had no occasion ever to encounter in person her remote though helpful cousin Rolf. It was unexpected that a girl of Celia's age and background should be deposited on her own in Paris and among artists, but she had requested it. She had always spoken quantities of French, and she could not see that there was anyone to make a fuss, as all her aunts were in Ireland, about 150 miles from Dublin, and in no position to go anywhere else, even if they had wished to. Fortunately, Celia could depend upon an adequate allowance. This was mainly because her father did not understand the value of money, and throughout his long life had made a point of refusing all advice about it or anything else. I know quite a few people like that. They all suck. Speaking of French, I know how to read it. I don't know how to speak it. I can read French quite well. I just can't speak it. The first things that Celia bought, apart from a few dresses, pairs of shoes and stockings, lovely lingerie, and even one or two hats, either very small or very large, were additional chattels for her miniature rooms, which, upon entry, she was surprised to find almost unfurnished, as if she had been living still in the days of Mimi, Musetta, Colleen, and all those well-known people. In particular, there was not one single mirror or looking glass, not one, not even a cracked fragment in the downstairs cabinet, which perhaps Milton at one corner, possibly Jay's, such as one found in bathing machines. Cecilia went out and purchased 4 or 5 looking glasses immediately. All but one would be used for all but one would be merely for use each day and were backed with nitrate, though certainly not mass-produced or in any way commonplace. But the last of her acquisitions might have stood in any bedroom at home. Oh, you mean like that one back there? Okay, well, I mean, fucking, I don't know. Celia had spotted it in one of the low, dark, hopelessly untidy shops where, until recently, one bought such things in Paris, and its capture had been an impulse of the instant, as is everything that is in any way real. Elements of nostalgia, even plain homesickness, no doubt entered in. The shop had proved to be run not by the usual very old man, but by an even older woman, though sprier and more grasping than nurse at home. The aged tricoteuse had driven a terribly hard bargain, but Celia had to possess the glass, first for the obvious reason that she could not live without it, secondly because it bore extremely faded traces of mysterious male and female figures round the upper part of the frame, thirdly because the face that had just looked back at her from the shallows and depths had not been her own. The short distance along which the glass had to be borne presented an even worse problem than the haggling, and the need for lugging it up so many narrow, winding, and decrepit stairs a worse one still. But the most complex of ordeals sometimes finds its own resolution, and now Celia sat before the beautiful mirror or looking glass, now in one new dress, now in another, and intermittently without troubling to put on a dress at all. She had to seat herself for these transactions because the looking glass was so short in frame. She had heard that our ancestors were more stunted than we are, though even this she knew had been contested by a woman who owned an immense collection of very old clothes, all of which she had measured anew, giving years to the work. Possibly the beautiful looking glass had been designed for the Gonzaga dwarfs, men and women, even as the faded figures gamboling round the top of the frame. Celia wondered if she would ever visit their tiny suites at Mantua, of which her father had shown her small yellow photographs taken years before with early flashbulbs. In the meantime, she would have to find a chaise longue that was stumpier in the shanks. Her own limbs were as long as they were lovely. So life continued for Celia, could not quite say how long, as her father wrote letters of any kind only on formal occasions, and Totlands really had no business or to transact with her beyond paying out her allowance with their usual precise punctuality. She had been well aware that Mr. Burfey had been more frightened of her than anything else. How long ago it began to seem. Time flies when we watch it, but has no need to fly when we ignore it. One morning, Celia felt quite certain of something that of late she had more and more suspected. She was not merely looking older, but looking much older, more grained, more perceptibly skinny. The first bright light of spring must have wrought the trick. At least Celia presumed it was the spring, which she had always distrusted, even artistically. She knew that spring is the season of maximum self-slaughter, and who could wonder? It was the season when doubt was no longer possible. Momentarily, she clutched at the neckline of her dress and managed to inflict an actual rent. Even the fabric of her garment seemed to have weakened slightly, and this had been an expensive garment once. Celia did not care to look very often in any of the glasses after that, but crept past and around them, her eyes on the jade or turquoise carpet. All the same, life has in some sense to go forward, as long as it bears with us all. And Celia, despite her tendency to melancholy, was perfectly courageous. Moreover, I don't know what's even happening. Moreover, she was finding more and more of herself in her art, and had been assured that soon she might quite easily win a medal of some kind. Of course, that had been said to her privately in order not to upset the others. She bought many new dresses to replace the ones she had torn. She even bought 6 fancy dresses or costumes that were all but that, with a view to meeting life from time to time in different and selected disguises. She bought a silk tie and 2 pairs of silk socks for a man she knew, all in excitingly aggressive colors and patterns. Sometimes she dwelt upon what it would be like to nurture 8 or 9 children, the fruit of her womb, upon their complex teething and schooling, upon some brusque, shadowy figure to pay for it all and act as head of the household. How long could it have been before Celia, despite her precautions, caught her own eye in the glass and realized that she must be middle-aged and beyond all chance of concealment? And needless to say, it had happened at the same dreadful morning hour when the brightness of the sun is equaled only by the blackness of the heart. Other faces had continued glinting back at her from time to time, but now she recognized that a stranger had intruded forever. She opened a letter that morning, and even though the dust had settled on it quite deeply, it was from David Skelt, the senior partner in Tutlands. He had never before been under any necessity to write to her personally, but had been able to leave the task to his staff, or at least to a partner who was greatly junior. Mr. Skelt informed her that her father had become so frail that nurse would need to be supplemented by at least one other nurse, and that her allowance would have to henceforth be halved at the least in consequence. He referred to these new nurses as trained nurses. Presumably that might make a big difference in some way. Prices in Paris were said to be rising, and the people to be changing in character, but Celia knew that she still had her art, as well as her beautiful looking-glass. She realized that her art must mean more to her with every day that sped past. Whether strangers cared for art or not, the other pupils could be counted upon for loyalty without flaw. Moreover, most of the pupils were nowadays little more than children, so that all could not sensibly be described as lost. There could always be a completely new generation. The future was an open question yet. Celia felt that she could not hold her own with the looking-glass by a continuous act of will. Celia even felt that she could hold her own with the looking-glass by a continuous act of will. Unremitting, resolute, robust. Long ago, nurse had upheld virtues of that kind, and now the time was come to practice them. One never knew what one could do until one tried. If one tried hard enough, one could be any age one chose. In the library at home, she had come upon St. Thomas Aquinas's promise to that effect, even though in Latin and in Gothic type that grew faint and gray as one watched, and never had more shape to the letters at the best of times. Aquinas is great, actually. I'm not even religious, but his stuff's great. And Latin's a fun language. I can read Latin quite well, I guess. Latin's fun. Alas, there were crab-sized holes in Celia's petticoat, and up and down the staircase rats on the rampage for food, however moldy and mottled. Cousin Rolf could not have known. Their delicate paws were like swift kisses on one's face and arms. It was just as in the attics at home. Celia took to attending each year the service at the Chapelle Expiatoire. No, I said that Italian way, good grief. the Chapel Expiator, and to painting pictures entitled Son of St. Louis, ascend to heaven. At these times she could feel the divine benediction cloaking her shoulders like a soft stole. The other pupils at the art school were either complete babies feeding from bottles containing cornflour, or in certain cases motionless skeletons also fed with cornflour, though not from bottles because they could not suck. It did not take long by any standard for the point to be reached where Celia's ever smaller allowance was intersected by the ever larger cost of everything. Sometimes the watchful could see her white hair and white face at the edge of the rotting curtain. As she looked out at the march past for social justice, through hunting glasses and telescopes, they could see plainly that her eyes were at once animated and frightened by the coarse thumping of the drums, the amateur screaming of the brass, the bellowing of the inebriated. She began cutting away the gangrene from her limbs, or what she assumed to be gangrene. She was too scared to use the sharpest knife she had, as no doubt she should have done. She preferred the small, elegant fruit knives precisely because they were rather blunt, and because they were silver, though not hallmarked with light, as had been so many of the knives at home. A trained surgeon would have acted upon their other values, though it is hard to see that they would have made much difference in the end. The times had become so harsh and the people so indifferent that the art school, after all these years, was in real danger of shutting. Celia reflected that one's art is strictly one's own, and that never should it mean more to her than it meant now, or shudderingly seldom. Faces she took to belong to Raphael, Luca Giordano, and Frederick Leighton. And Frederick Leighton, I mean, good grief, why am I so stuck on Italian? Frederick Leighton now looked upon her, exultantly and extortingly, from within the beautiful looking-glass. She was not at art school or trying to buy simple things with almost no money, a dressing jacket, a pair of gloves, a flask of flowery liqueur. Celia spent most of her time gazing, as she would hardly have been able to deny. Only in that way could she be true to herself. But never until now had she seen faces or forms to which she could attach names. Too often of late she had seen shapes, for which no name was possible. On occasion they had emerged, and it had to be driven back with implements she had found on sale second hand at very low prices near Le Hall, and presumably intended for the meat trade in one of its aspects. Sometimes she was horrified by the spectacle she was compelled to make of herself, and her father might have had an asthma attack had he seen it. Celia knew perfectly well that if she was to stand any chance of making a permanent mark, as the faces expected of her, then she should practice more, as ballerinas have to do, and ladies and gentlemen who master enormous pianofortes. She should be plucky, confident, and indefatigable, like Rosa Bonheur. She should probably look like Rosa Bonheur also, though she had enough difficulty already in hanging on to looks of any kind. Still, there it was, the demand of art. The demands of art are notoriously boundless, nor are they subject to appeal. "Oh, let me join you!" cried Celia, stretching out her arms to the real Celia within the beautiful mirror's mysterious depths. The real Celia stretched voluptuously in a patterned dress on the chaise longue she had bought with such innocent ardor, and of which the beseeching Celia lay upon the decayed wreckage, virtually upon the sloping floor, gazed upon by 100 expectant eyes. The colored figures at the top of the frame had entirely faded long ago. Celia thought that the real Celia slightly moved one pale hand and even opened her eyes a little wider. She could not remember whether the patterned dress was a silk dress for parties or a cotton dress for shopping. The pattern was known as Capet. In any case, there would be no actual harm done if she continued to supplicate, to beseech. Once about this time, Celia actually heard from Mr. Murphy. It was the very first letter she had ever received from him, and Celia was quite glad that she had opened it, even though the address on the envelope had been merely typewritten. Mr. Burfey said that he had often thought of their romantic trip to Paris together, that he fancied there might be no harm in his recalling it now, that her father unfortunately needed more trained nurses all the time, and that there was almost no money left from which to pay for anything, and that he, Mr. Burfey, was about to retire after generations of service with the firm, and was writing to everyone he knew and could remember for that reason. The rest of the staff had subscribed to buy him a small electric clock, which had taken him completely by surprise, and particularly when Mr. Daniel himself had found a few moments to participate in the presentation. Celia thought for a long, long time about the elms and urns and tiny bubbling springs in her father's park, about the tenant farmer's comely, contented cows and occasional frisky bulls. She thought about the 47 catalogued likenesses of her ancestors in collaterals, many of them in large familial groups, one of them turned to the wall. She thought about the schoolroom with a dozen desks and only one occupant. She thought of the withered fan in the conservatory, the property of ladies who, for her, had been dead always. She listened in memory to the mad hunt at twilight, and saw it take form. She smelled the rotting grapes with the German name, and the ullaged wine with no name at all. She felt the wet camel hair bristles on the back of her slender hand, as she painted the world and herself into a certain transcendence. Celia had all along been required to pay the rent in advance, especially as she was a foreigner, and she became anxious if she did not meet all demands in cash, and with punctuality to say the least of it. Often her purse, however slim, was considerably more than punctual, and most of all with the rent. These rigors may have combined to reverse the effect intended, as so often in life, because somehow the payment due from Celia after the last payment she was able to make, and had made more prematurely than ever, came to be overlooked altogether. It is not such an uncommon event in Paris as is generally supposed. Quite unfairly, there was a small scandal when Celia was certified to have been dead for something like 4 or 5 months, before any part of her was actually found by a visitor from the outside world. After various alarums had been raised, some of them by observers on the other side of the street, the elderly married couple who lived far below Celia and looked after the place as best they could, sent their burly young nephew Armand to beat upon the door, and if necessary, to beat it down. Armand admitted that he had not cared for the job from the first. Not much difficulty was encountered or effort required. Even the noise was minimal, or at least the disturbance, largely because the elderly couple had prudently selected a time which was well after dark, but well before most people had taken to their beds. In fact, when most people were likely to be most preoccupied with one distraction or another. In no time Armand came hurtling all the way down again, nearly doing himself an injury in the feeble light. What he had to say was that he had quite clearly seen the madam lying there in the mirror, but no madam in the room itself. However, this summary proved possibly erroneous, on at least 2 counts. The figure seen in the mirror proved upon Armand's cross-examination by his adoring aunt and all the community to be not Madame at all, but Mademoiselle perhaps, and therefore beside the present point. And Madame was in the room herself, though as to what happened to her, the pathologist ultimately declared to make a declaration. And Madame was in the room herself, though as to what had happened to her, the pathologist ultimately declined to make a declaration. The press thought it might have been rats, and it was mainly the hypothesis which caused the scandal, such as it was. That's that one. Sad story. Um, Quite honestly, That one gives me the chills every time I read it. I've read this book like 4 or 5 times now, and that's one of the stories in here that still gives me the chills. If you join when I was in the middle of reading it, or before I mentioned what the title was, and literally just scroll back on the timeline, maybe stop being an idiot. Like, goddamn, really not that fucking hard. Right. Next one I want to read in here was one I said I was going to read before, and it's my favorite one in here. It's called Wood. I don't really care if I'm rude, quite frankly. I'm blunt. I don't know you. I'm never gonna meet you in the real world. So, like, oh well, if I'm rude. I don't even know if. Just whatever. Anyway, yeah. Next, as I said, is the story Wood. And this one is my favorite in the book. Genuinely quite a chilling read. By the end, so, I'm reading it now. So my niece, Eleanor, has given me one of those weather houses where the woman comes out with when it is likely to be fine and the man when it is going to rain. I did not think they were made anymore. There is something about them that not many people know, at least nowadays. It is this, that just as dowsing can be used to trace many things other than water, which of course makes water divining quite the wrong name for it, so these little weather houses, or some of them, can be attuned to foretell more things than the merely literal state of the heavens. It is an odd story of which I am reminded by this, and until now I have not cared to make note of it. There is always a risk of a written record coming into the wrong hands, and so perhaps reaching the eyes or ears of the people described. Moreover, I was always very uncertain how far I could depend upon my own impressions of what happened, and naturally I am even less confident now, nearly 20 years later. Also, one is superstitious about seeming to give a new life, by writing about it, to something which has frightened one. The curious case of Munn and his wife, whatever I thought about the reality of it, even at the time, certainly frightened me. So much that I was the last person to be surprised by what happened to them in the end. But old Pell and his wife are dead now too, so here goes. I suppose if anyone at all reads what I am writing, it is more likely than not to be a stranger. A few sentences about myself had therefore better come first. I served my articles as an architect in the days when that was how one learned a profession, by working at practical and immediate problems from the first, instead of merely listening to lectures and doing exercises. And for several years I worked as an architect's assistant in a good office, doing well, and having every prospect of starting in practice on my own. The tone was set in those days by architects such as Ernest George, and there seemed an unlimited number of costly country houses being built. Pleasant work for all who had the social knack of getting it, which did not seem very difficult as I look back on it. But then came the war, the first one and the real one, the greatest mistake mankind ever made, in my opinion, but curiously enough, one out of which I myself did quite well, at least in a sense. Before it was over, and to my considerable surprise, I found myself a lieutenant colonel, though very much of the wartime kind, not the real thing, as I knew perfectly well. But then, in the very last month, more or less when Wilfred Owen was killed, if I have it right, I was not killed, but badly knocked out. Since then I have never been quite right in any way, even though I made a good recovery, and a remarkably swift one. Of course, I had always intended to go back into architecture, but I never quite did. There were several factors. One was that I began to receive a pension, which at first seemed fairly good. Enough, anyway, to save one from having to rush at things, and to give one time to think. Another and much more important was that the profession had completely changed. We were fast on the way to the state of affairs where the word art was seldom mentioned, still less the word beauty. It is odd that the busy, slave-driving old offices, always with several pupils, had much to say about art and beauty. Too much, many of the pupils thought. Well, these new schools of architecture led to nothing but, for example, the buildings you can see beside and around the festival hall in London. A third thing was I never succeeded in marrying and thus taking on a new incentive. The war seemed to do nothing to me there. Seemed to do something to me there, or perhaps it was mainly my experiences at the end of the war. But what settled things at first was that I was offered the job of editing a series of architectural lives. I had always been interested in the actual lives and careers of the architects of history, and the work carried me away for a longish time. I was enabled to travel, in a modest way, though there again I could not have paid for a wife to travel with me, and I was in a position to appoint myself as the author of 2 or 3 of the books. I did so, and these books proved to be among the most successful of the series, for what that meant. When I was in my mid-40s, I bought an old cottage outside this Suffolk village, without clearly realizing that East Anglia is preeminently the part of England to which unattached and unattachable males with tiny but comparatively secure incomes tend to drift. They settle there on the outskirts of villages, and I must admit, seem often to live on forever, though no one quite knows what they do all day. Edward Fitzgerald is the archetype and patron of us all, though speaking for myself, I have so far managed to keep my hands off the local fishing lads. But then Fitzgerald was a genius, even though an underproductive one. I, no genius, have managed to have many affairs of the more ordinary kind, mainly indeed with married women. It does not seem a thing one should proclaim, but it is no joke being a married woman in East Anglia, if the woman has the smallest imagination. I am therefore unabashed. Elfie, what are you doing? What are you doing, buddy? No, really. Buddy. You're such a cute cat. I love you. Hey, you. Oh, okay. Hello. Hello. Get your claw out of me. I'm trying to read here, buddy. Okay, that odd man, Munn, on the other hand, seemed, during the first years I knew him, to be genuinely uninterested in women. Of course, I did not know him really well then, or ever, and one can be utterly mistaken in such assessments. Still, many English males are generally unconcerned about women, or without the need for them, especially after the age of 30 or so. Or they're gay, but don't mention that, because it's this, because, fucking early 1900s, fucking, he's been, don't have to elaborate on that. Buddy. Dude, you have water over there if you're thirsty. You do know that, right? Yes, I love you too. Delphi. Munn struck me in those days as one who, instead of embracing a woman, embraced a grievance. Unlike most Unlike most people with entrenched grievances, he was as reticent about the details as one normally is, as one should be about the details. Okay, that was burp. About the details of a love relationship. He had been employed in the Inland Revenue, and there had been trouble of some kind, though it was hard to guess what, because he had emerged with a small allowance, upon which, like me, he lived. In his case, in rooms above the village post office. Possibly he unearthed some corruption or other, and had to be sacked and silenced. If Munn had been still in the employ of the tax people, instead of on bad terms with them, I could never have known him even as an acquaintance. Betty. Actually, yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next book now. Already read one story in there, but next I'm gonna read one or two M.R. James stories because M.R. James, he's a master. He is an absolute master at the ghost story. Every single one of them gave me chills, basically. Every single one of them made me afraid to go out in the hallway at night. So, spooky stories. And fuck you if you say, why are you reading spooky stories in November? Because spooky season is whatever the fuck you want it to be, bitch. That's why. Quite frankly, Christmas can go suck a fucking dick. Which one will I read? Well, I am considering reading the one that, well, unsettled me the most, which was Count Magnus. So I will go to that one. Here we are. Alrighty. Count Magnus by M.R. James. This is the story in here that gave me the most fear, I guess. Yeah, fear. Really, really, really good story. I mean, all of his stories are great, but, this one in particular. By what means the papers out of which I have made a connected story came into my hands is the last point which the reader will learn from these pages. But it is necessary to prefix my extracts from them a statement of the form in which I possessed them. They consist, then, partly of a series of collections for a book of travels, such a volume as was a common product of the 40s and 50s. Buddy, no, you're being annoying. I'm sorry, get your claw out of me. That's not nice. It's not nice, buddy. Don't claw me. They consist, then, partly of a series of collections for a book of travels, such a volume as was a common product of the 40s and 50s. Horace Murat's Journal of Residence in Jutland in the Danish Isles is a fair specimen of the class to which I allude. These books usually treated of some unfamiliar district on the continent. They were illustrated with woodcuts or steel plates. They gave details of hotel accommodation and of means of communication, such as we now expect to find in any well-regulated guidebook, and they dealt largely in reported conversations with intelligent foreigners, racy innkeepers, and garrulous peasants. In a word, they were chatty. Begun with the idea of furnishing material for such a book, my papers, as they progressed, assumed the character of a record of one single personal experience, and this record was continued up to the very eve, almost, of its termination. The writer was a Mr. Wraxall. From my knowledge of him, I have to depend entirely on the evidence that his writings afford, and from these I deduce that he was a man past middle age, possessed of some private means, and very much alone in the world. He had, it seems, no settled abode in England, but was a denizen of hotels and boarding houses. It is probable that he entertained the idea of settling down at some future time which never came, and I think it also likely that the Pantechnicon fire in the early 70s must have destroyed a great deal that would have thrown light on his antecedents, for he refers once or twice to property of his that was warehoused at that establishment. It is further apparent that Mr. Wraxall had published a book, and that it treated of a holiday he had once taken to Brittany. More than this I cannot say about his work, because a diligent search in bibliographical works has convinced me that it must have appeared either anonymously or under a pseudonym. As to his character, it is not difficult to form some superficial opinion. He must have been an intelligent and cultivated man. It seems that he was near being a fellow of his college at Oxford, Brasenose, as I judge from the calendar. His besetting fault was pretty clearly that of over-inquisitiveness, possibly a good fault in a traveler, certainly a fault for which this traveler paid dearly enough in the end. I love characters like that. Jonathan Sims from Magnus Archives, for instance. I mean, a bit more extreme in that case, but I am also very inquisitive about things, so I mean, that's not why this story scared me as much as it did, but, it's part of the reason, you'll see. On what proved to be his last expedition, he was plotting another book. Scandinavia, a region not widely known to Englishmen 40 years ago, had struck him as an interesting field. He must have lighted on some old books of Swedish history or memoirs, and the idea of travel in Sweden, interspersed with episodes from the history of some of the great Swedish families. He procured letters of introduction, therefore, to some persons of quality in Sweden, and set out thither in the early summer of 1863. Of his travels in the north there is no need to speak, nor of his residence of some weeks in Stockholm. I need only mention that some savant resident there put him on the track of an important collection of family papers belonging to the proprietors of an ancient manor house in Västergötland, and obtained for him permission to examine them. The manor house, or Ergård, in question is to be called Robach, though that is not its name. It is one of the best buildings of its kind in all the country, and the picture of it in Dahlenberg's Sunschia Antiquitat Moderna, engraved in 1694, shows it very much as the tourist may see it today. It was built soon after 1600, and is, roughly speaking, very much like an English house of that period in respect of material. Red brick with stone facings and style. The man who built it was a scion of the great house of De la Garde, and his descendants possess it still. De la Garde is the name by which I will designate them when mention of them becomes necessary. They received Mr. Wraxall with great kindness and courtesy, and pressed him to stay in the house as long as his researches lasted. But preferring to be independent, and mistrusting his powers of conversing in Swedish, he settled himself at the village inn, which turned out quite sufficiently comfortable at any rate during the summer months. This arrangement would entail a short walk daily to and from the manor house of something under a mile. The house itself stood in a park and was protected, we should say grown up, with large old timber. Near it you found the walled garden, and then entered a close wood fringing one of the small lakes with which the whole country is pitted. Then came the wall of Desme, and you climbed a steep knoll, a knob of rock lightly covered with soil, and on top of this stood the church, fenced in with tall dark trees. It was a curious building to English eyes. The nave and aisles were low and filled with pews and galleries. In the western gallery stood the famous old organ, gaily painted and with silver pipes. The ceiling was flat, and had been adorned by a 17th-century artist with a strange and hideous Last Judgment, full of lurid flames, falling cities, burning ships, crying souls, and brown and smiling demons. Handsome brass coronae hung from the roof. The pulpit was like a doll's house, covered with little painted wooden cherubs and saints. A stand with 3 hourglasses was hinged to the preacher's desk. Such sights as these may be seen in many a church in Sweden now, but what distinguished this one was an addition to the original building. At the eastern end of the north aisle, the builder of the manor house had erected a mausoleum for himself and his family. It was a largish eight-sided building, lighted by a series of oval windows, and it had a domed roof topped by a kind of pumpkin-shaped object rising into a spire, a form in which Swedish architects greatly delighted. The roof was of copper externally, and was painted black, while the walls, in common with those of the church, were staringly white. To this mausoleum there was no access from the church. It had a portal and steps of its own on the northern side. Past the churchyard, the path to the village goes, and not more than 3 or 4 minutes bring you to the inn door. On the first day of his stay in Rabach, Mr. Wraxall found the church door open and made notes of the interior which I have epitomized. Into the mausoleum, however, he could not make his way. He could by looking through the keyhole just descry what were fine marble effigies and sarcophagi of copper, and a wealth of armorial ornament, which made him very anxious to spend some time in investigation. The papers he had come to examine at the manor house proved to be just of the kind he wanted for his book. There were family correspondence, journals, and account books of the earliest owners of the estate, very carefully kept and clearly written, full of amusing and picturesque detail. The first de la Garde appeared in them as a strong and capable man. Shortly after the building of the mansion, there had been a period of distress in the district, and the peasants had risen and attacked several chateaux and done some damage. The owner of Roebuck took a leading part in suppressing the trouble, and there were reference to executions of ringleaders and severe punishments inflicted with no sparing hand. The portrait of this Magnus de la Garde was one of the best in the house, and Mr. Wraxall studied it with no little interest after his day's work. He gives no detailed description of it, but I gather that the face impressed him rather by its power than by its beauty or goodness. In fact, he writes that Count Magnus was an almost phenomenally ugly man. On this day, Mr. Wraxall took his supper with the family and walked back in the late but still bright evening. I must remember, he writes, to ask the sexton if he can let me into the mausoleum at the church. He evidently has access to it himself, for I saw him tonight standing on the steps, and, as I thought, locking or unlocking the door. I find that early on the following day Mr. Wraxall had some conversation with his landlord. His setting it down at such length as he does surprised me at first, but I soon realized the papers I were reading were, at least in their beginning, the materials for the book he was meditating, and that it was to have been one of those quasi-journalistic productions which admit of the introduction of an admixture of conversational matter. His object, he says, was to find out whether any traditions of Count Magnus de la Garde lingered on in the scenes of that gentleman's activity, and whether the popular estimate of him were favorable or not. He found that the Count was decidedly not a favorite. If his tenants came late to their work on the days which they owed to him as lord of the manor, they were set on the wooden horse or flogged and branded in the manor house yard. One of two cases there were of men who had occupied lands which encroached on the lord's domain, and whose houses had been mysteriously burnt on a winter's night with the whole family inside. But what seemed to dwell on the innkeeper's mind most, for he returned to the subject more than once, was that the Count had been on the Black Pilgrimage, and had brought something or someone back with him. You will naturally inquire, as Mr. Wraxall did, what the Black Pilgrimage may have been, but your curiosity on the point must remain unsatisfied for the time being, just as his did. The landlord was evidently unwilling to give a full answer, or indeed any answer on the point, and being called out for a moment, trotted off with obvious alacrity, only putting his head in at the door a few minutes afterward to say that he was called away to Skara, and should not be back till evening. So Mr. Wraxall had to go unsatisfied to his day's work at the manor house. The papers on which he was just then engaged soon put his thoughts into another channel, for he had to occupy himself with glancing over the correspondence between Sophia Albertina in Stockholm and her married cousin, Ulrich Leonora, at Roebuck in the year 1705 to 1710. The letters were of exceptional interest from the light they threw upon the culture of that period in Sweden, as anyone can testify who has read the full edition of them in the publications of the Swedish Historical Manuscripts Commission. In the afternoon he had done with these, and after returning the boxes in which they were kept to their places on the shelf, he proceeded very naturally to take down some of the volumes nearest to them, in order to determine which of them had best be his principal subject of investigation the next day. The shelf he had hit upon was occupied mostly by a collection of account books in the writing of the first Count Magnus, but one among them was not an account book, but a book of alchemical and other tracts in another 16th century hand. Not being very familiar with alchemical literature, Mr. Wraxall spends much space with which he might have spared in setting out the names and beginnings of the various treatises. The Book of the Phoenix, Book of the 30 Words, Book of the Toad, Book of Miriam, Turba Philosophorum, and so on. And then he announces, with a good deal of circumstance, his delight at finding, on a leaf originally left blank near the middle of the book, some writing of Count Magnus himself, headed Liber Nigre Peregrinatus. It is true that only a few lines were written, but there was quite enough to show that the landlord had that morning been referring to a belief at least as old as the time of Count Magnus, and probably shared by him. This is the English of what was written. If any man desires to obtain a long life, as he would obtain a faithful messenger and see the blood of his enemies, it is necessary that he should go first into the city of Chorazin, and there salute the prince. Here there was an erasure of one word, not very thoroughly done, so that Mr. Wraxall felt pretty sure that he was right in reading it as Ares, of the air. But there was no more of the text copied, only a line in Latin. Quare relinqua hujus mettere insectiore. Fucking no. Quare relinqua hujus mettere inter secretora. Latin is one of the languages I am very well versed in and can read quite well, but I'm not going to translate anything for you because see the rest of this matter among the more private things. Well, there you go. Forgot it was translated. There you go. It cannot be denied that this threw a rather lurid light upon the tastes and beliefs of the Count, but to Mr. Wraxall, separated from him by nearly 3 centuries, the thought that he might have added to his general forcefulness alchemy, and to alchemy something like magic, only made him a more picturesque figure. And when, after a rather prolonged contemplation of his picture on the wall, Mr. Wraxall set out on his homeward way, his mind was full of the thought of Count Magnus. He had no eyes for his surroundings, no perception of the evening scents of the woods or the evening light on the lake, and when all of a sudden he pulled up short, he was astonished to find himself already at the gate of the churchyard and within a few minutes of his dinner. His eyes fell on the mausoleum. "Ah," he said, "Count Magnus, there you are. I should dearly like to see you." Like many solitary men, he writes, I have a habit of talking to myself aloud. Same. And unlike many of the Greek and Latin particles, I do not expect an answer. Certainly, and perhaps fortunately in this case, there was neither voice nor any that regarded, only the woman who, I suppose, was cleaning up the church. Dropped some metallic object on the floor whose clang startled me. Count Magnus, I think, sleeps sound enough. That same evening, the landlord of the inn, who had heard Mr. Wraxall say that he wished to see the clerk or deacon, as he would be called in Sweden, of the parish, introduced him to that official in the inn parlor. A visit to the De la Garde tomb house was soon arranged for the next day, and a little general conversation ensued. Mr. Wraxall, remembering that one function of Scandinavian deacons is to teach candidates for confirmation, thought he would refresh his own memory on a biblical point. "Can you tell me," he said, "anything about Chorazin?" The deacon seemed startled, but readily it reminded him how that village had once been denounced. "To be sure," said Mr. Wraxall, it is, I suppose, quite a ruin now." "So I expect," replied the deacon. "I have heard some of our old priests say that the Antichrist is to be born there, and there are tales—" "Ah, what tales are those?" Mr. Wraxall put in. "Tales, I was going to say, which I have forgotten," said the deacon, and soon after he said good night. The landlord was now alone, and at all Mr. Raxall's mercy, and that inquirer was not inclined to spare him. Herr Nielsen, he said, I have found out something about the Black Pilgrimage. You may as well tell me what you know. What did the Count bring back with him? Swedes are habitually slow, perhaps, in answering, or perhaps the landlord was an exception. I am not sure, but Mr. Axel notes that the landlord spent at least 1 minute in looking at him before he said anything at all. Then he came up close to his guest, and with a good deal of effort he spoke. Mr. Axel, I can tell you this one little tale and no more, not any more. You must not ask anything what I have done. In my grandfather's time, that is, 92 years ago, there were 2 men who said, The Count is dead, we do not care for him. We will go tonight and have a free hunt in his wood, the long wood on the hill that you have seen behind Rabach. Well, those that heard them say this, they said, No, do not go. We are sure you will meet with persons walking who should not be walking. They should be resting, not walking. These men laughed. There were no forest men to keep the wood because no one wished to hunt there. The family were not there at the house. These men could do what they wished. Very well, they go to the wood that night. My grandfather was sitting here in his room. It was the summer, and a light night. With the window open, he could see out to the wood and hear. So he sat there, and 2 or 3 men with him, and they listened. At first they hear nothing at all. Then they hear someone. You know how far away it is. They hear someone scream, just as if the most inside part of his soul was twisted out of him. All of them in the room caught hold of each other, and they sat so for 3/4 of an hour. Then they hear someone else, only about 300 ells off. They hear him laugh aloud. It was not one of those 2 men that laughed, and indeed, they have all of them said that it was not any man at all. After that, they heard a great door shut. Then, when it was just light with the sun, they all went to the priest. They said to him, Father, put on your gown and your ruff, and come to bury these men, Anders Bjornson and Hans Thorbjorn. You understand that they were sure these men were dead. So they went to the wood. My grandfather never forgot this. He said that they were all alike, so many dead men themselves. The priest, too. He was in a white fear. He said when they came to him, I heard one cry in the night, and I heard one laugh afterwards. If I cannot forget that, I shall not be able to sleep again. So they went to the wood, and they found these men on the edge of the wood. Hans Thorbjorn was standing with his back against a tree, and all the time he was pushing with his hands, pushing something away from him, which was not there. So he was not dead, and they led him away and took him to the house at Nicknoppen, and he died there the winter, and he died before the winter. But he went on pushing with his hands. Also, Anders Bjornson was there, but he was dead. And I tell you this about Anders Bjornson, that he was once a beautiful man, but now his face was not there, because the flesh of it was sucked away off the bones. You understand that? My grandfather did not forget that. And they laid him on the bier which they brought, and they put a cloth over his head, and the priest walked before, and they began to sing the psalm for the dead as well as they could. So as they were singing the end of the first verse, one fell down who was carrying the head of the bier, and the others looked back, and they saw that the cloth had fallen off, and the eyes of Anders Bjornson were looking up, because there was nothing to close over them, and this they could not bear. Therefore the priest laid the cloth upon him and set for a spade, and they buried him in that place. The next day, Mr. Axel records that the deacon called for him soon after breakfast, and took him to the church and mausoleum. He noticed that the key of the ladder was hung on a nail just by the pulpit, and it occurred to him that, as the church doors seemed to be left unlocked as a rule, it would not be difficult for him to pay a second and more private visit to the monuments if there proved to be more interest among them than could be digested at first. The building, when he entered it, he found not unimposing. The monuments, mostly large erections of the 17th and 18th centuries, were dignified if luxuriant, and the epitaphs and heraldry were copious. The central space of the domed room was occupied by 3 copper sarcophagi, covered with finely engraved ornament. 2 of them had, as is commonly the case in Denmark and Sweden, a large metal crucifix on the lid. Delphi, please, I'm narrating stuff right now. I love you, buddy, but not right now. The third, that of Count Magnus as it appeared, had instead of that a full-length effigy engraved upon it, and round the edge were several bands of similar ornament representing various scenes. One was a battle, with cannon belching out smoke, and walled towns and troops of pikemen. Another showed an execution, and a third among trees was a man running at full speed, with flying hair and outstretched hands. After him followed a strange form. It would be hard to say whether the artist had intended for it to be a man, and was unable to give the requisite similitude, or whether it was intentionally made as monstrous as it looked. Buddy, what do you want? In view of the skill with which the rest of the drawing was done, Mr. Raxo felt inclined to adopt the latter idea. The figure was unduly short and was for the most part muffled in the hooded garment which swept the ground. The only part of the form which projected from that shelter was not shaped like any hand or arm. Mr. Axel Well, hello. What's going on, Delphi? What? Buddy? Where's he at? Yes, hello. Mr. Raxel compares it to the tentacle of the devilfish, and continues, on seeing this, I said to myself, this then, which is evidently an allegorical representation of some kind, a fiend pursuing a hunted soul, may be the origin of the story of Count Magnus and his mysterious companion. Let us see how the huntsman is pictured. Doubtless it will be a demon blowing his horn, but as it turned out there was no such sensational figure. Only the semblance of a cloaked man on a hillock, who stood leaning on a stick and watching the hunt with interest which the engraver had tried to express in his attitude. Mr. Axel noted the finely worked and massive steel padlocks, 3 in number, which secured the sarcophagus. One of them, he saw, was detached and lay on the pavement, and then, unwilling to delay the deacon longer, or waste his own working time, he made his way onward to the manor house. It is curious, he notes, how on retracing a familiar path, one's thoughts engross one to the absolute exclusion of surrounding objects. Tonight, for the second time, I had entirely failed to notice where I was going. I had planned a private visit to the tomb house to copy the epitaphs when I suddenly, as it were, awoke to consciousness, and found myself, as before, turning in at the churchyard gate, and I believe singing or chanting some such words as, "Are you awake, Count Magnus? Are you asleep, Count Magnus?" And then something more which I have failed to recollect. It seemed to me that I must have been behaving in this nonsensical way for some time. He found the key of the mausoleum where he had expected to find it, and copied the greater part of what he wanted. In fact, he stayed until the light began to fail him. I must have been wrong, he writes, in saying that one of the padlocks of my Count's sarcophagus was unfastened. I see tonight that two are loose. I picked both up and laid them carefully on the window ledge after trying unsuccessfully to close them. The remaining one is still firm, and though I take it to be a spring lock, I cannot guess how it is opened. Had I succeeded in undoing it, I am most afraid I should have taken the liberty of opening the sarcophagus. It is strange the interest I feel in the personality of this, I fear, somewhat ferocious and grim old noble. The day following was, as it turned out, the last of Mr. Raxall's stay at Rabuck. He received letters connected with certain investments, which made it desirable that he should return to England. His work among the papers was practically done, and traveling was slow. He decided, therefore, to make his farewells, put some finishing touches to his notes, and be off. These finishing touches, and farewells as it turned out, took more time than he had expected. The hospitable family insisted on staying to dine with them, and they dined at 3, and it was verging on 6:30 before he was outside the iron gates of Rabuck. He dwelt on every step of his walk by the lake, determined to saturate himself, now that he had trod it for the last time, in the sentiment of the place and hour. And when he reached the summit of the churchyard knoll, he lingered for many minutes, gazing at the limitless prospect of woods near and distant, all dark beneath a sky of liquid green. When at last he turned to go, the thought struck him that surely he must bid farewell to Count Magnus as well as the rest of the De la Gardes. The church was but 20 yards away, and he knew where the key of the mausoleum hung. It was not long before he was standing over the great copper coffin, and as usual, talking to himself aloud. "You may have been a bit of a rascal in your time, Magnus," he was saying, "but for all that I should like to see you, or rather—" Just at that instant, he says, I felt a blow on my foot. Hastily enough, I drew it back, and something fell on the pavement with a clash. It was the third, the last of the 3 padlocks. "Okay, Miss, get your claws out of me. Ow. Owie. Okay. Why do you claw? Why is that a thing? Why do you... don't do that." Owie. It was the third, the last of the 3 padlocks which had fastened the sarcophagus. I stooped to pick it up, and heaven is my witness that I am writing only the bare truth. Before I had raised myself, there was a sound of metal hinges creaking, and I distinctly saw the lid shifting upwards. I may have behaved like a coward, but I could not for my life stay for one moment. I was outside that dreadful building in less time than I can write, almost as quickly as I could have said it. The words, and what frightens me yet more, I could not turn the key in the lock. As I sit here in my room noting these facts, I ask myself, it was not 20 minutes ago, whether that noise of creaking metal continued, and I cannot tell whether it did or not. I only know that there was something more that I have written that alarmed me, but whether it was sound or sight I am unable to remember. What is this that I have done? Poor Mr. Raxall. He set out on his journey to England on the next day as he had planned, and he reached England in safety, and yet, as I gather from his changed hand and inconsequent jottings, a broken man. One of several small notebooks that have come to me with his papers gives not a key to, but a kind of inkling of, his experiences. Much of his journey was made by canal boat, and I find not less than 6 painful attempts to enumerate and describe his fellow passengers. The entries are of this kind. 24. Passed through a village in Skien. Usual black coat and soft black hat. 25. Commercial villager from Stockholm going to Trollhättan. Black coat, brown hat. 26. Man in long black coat, broad-leafed hat, very old-fashioned. This entry is lined out and a note added, perhaps identical with number 13, have not yet seen his face.
On furry number 13, I find that he is a Roman priest in a cassock. The net result of the reckoning is always the same. 28 people appear in the enumeration, one being always a man in a long black cloak and broad hat, and the other a short figure in a dark cloak and hood. On the other hand, it is always noted that only 26 passengers appear at meals, and that the man in the cloak is perhaps absent, and the short figure is certainly absent. On reaching England, it appears that Mr. Wraxall headed for Harwich, and that he resolved at once to put himself out of reach of some person or persons of whom he never specifies, but whom he had evidently come to regard as his pursuers. Accordingly, he took a vehicle. It was a closed fly, not trusting the railway, and drove across country to the village of Belchamp St. Paul. It was about 9 o'clock on a moonlit August night when he neared the place. He was sitting forward and looking out of the window at the fields and thickets. There was little else to be seen, racing past him. Suddenly he came to a crossroad. At the corner 2 figures were standing motionless. Both were in dark cloaks. The taller one wore a hat, the shorter a hood. He had no time to see their faces, nor did they make any motion that he could discern. Yet the horse shied violently and broke into a gallop, and Mr. Wraxall sank back in his seat in something like desperation. He had seen them before. Arriving at Belchamp St. Paul, he was fortunate enough to find a decent furnished lodging, and for the next 24 hours he lived, comparatively speaking, in peace. His last notes were written on this day. They are too disjointed and ejaculatory to be given here in full, but the substance of them is clear enough. He is expecting a visit from his pursuers. How or when he knows not, and his constant cry is, "What has he done, and is there no hope?" Doctors, he knows, would call him mad. Policemen would laugh at him. The parson is away. What can he do but lock his door and cry to God? People still remembered last year at Belchamp St. Paul how a strange gentleman came one evening in August years back, and how the next morning but one he was found dead, and there was an inquest, and the jury that viewed the body fainted. Some of them did, and none of them would speak to what they see, and the verdict was visitation of God, and how the people kept the house moved out that same week, and went away from that part. But they do not, I think, know that any glimmer of light has ever been thrown, or could be thrown on that mystery. It so happened that last year the little house came into my hands as a part of a legacy. It has stood empty since 1863, and there seemed no prospect of letting it, so I had pulled it down, and the papers of which I have given you an abstract were found in a forgotten cupboard under the window in the best bedroom. Yeah, that's a story in this story collection that scared me the most, and I'm not being. It still has gotten me very unsettled, and I really don't want to fucking go out my room now because I'm really spooked. Um, yeah, cool. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna give you fuckers a taste of what I'm feeling. I'm gonna go to the bathroom, and you're gonna be in here with the lights off for like as long as it takes.
Oh boy. Was that spooky or what? But yeah. This is the stories I'm reading. Just don't want to narrate anymore. So thanks for watching, fuckers, I guess. Fuck off now.